let us go to the next panel. So we're moving from the public sector to the private sector. And if I could ask the participants, Peter, Gretchen, Laura, Ioana, and Jed, to put your cameras on so that we can see that we actually have a panel. As was heard from the early introductions, the idea is not just to focus on the release of public sector data, but the third wave is also about the release of private sector data. And so that's the focus of this panel, which is what's the current state of actually advancing access to private sector data, whether it's data from, for instance, pharmaceuticals, or data from, for instance, Microsoft or satellite, or data that is collected for mapping purposes as well, and of course also data from social media. And in order to facilitate this panel, I'm joined by Beth, so I give the floor to Beth, who can do the introduction and then subsequently take it away. Over to you, Beth. And Beth, for those, I'm not sure I need an introduction, Beth Noveck is the co-founder of GovLab, but also the director of the Burns Center and based in Boston. Over to you, Beth.
Thank you very much. And boy, you run a very tight ship, spot on time for getting started. Thank you so much. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for organizing this. And thank you to all of our panelists and to those of you who are joining us. So let me just give a quick tour de table, if you will, in the interest of speed and time for who is joining us. You've already heard some reference to who they were. We'll paste their bios in the chat, but I'm very happy to be joined here by Ioana Stoenescu, who's External Affairs and Personalized Healthcare Lead at Roche. We have Peter Rabley, apologies if I have the pronunciation wrong, you'll correct me as we go along, Managing Partner for Place Trust. Jed Sundwall, Executive Director of Radiant Earth Foundation, Laura McGorman, Director for Data for Good at Meta, and Gretchen Deo, Director of Policy Outreach and Open Innovation at Microsoft. So as Stefan already alluded, we're going to continue the conversation from the previous panel and really try to focus on this incredibly important resource of privately held data that has become a key priority when we are considering data policies, is how we both make access to private data as much as public data open and available. So through new forms of data collaborations and data sharing agreements and other models, companies, civil society groups, and others are now able to make data sets accessible for the public good and usable by a variety of sectors. And so we have to ensure, as we have this conversation, that we're moving not just from policy agreements about how to do this and in principle, but what we're really here to talk about is how we do so in practice, make the data available and use it again for the good for which it's intended. So for this next chunk of time, we're going to focus on emerging models for data collaboration in the public sector, what the policies are, but more importantly, what the practices are, and what the governance structures are that we need to put in place in order to make sure that data collaboration is sustainable, is systematic, and is responsible above all. So let's dive in with that. And I'm going to ask Ioana to get us started here and to talk to us a little bit about the secondary use of data in the healthcare sector. This has been a long topic for a while here. And so I'm hoping you can kind of update us on progress that's existed to date that's enabled more systematic access to data on the healthcare side, especially for population health.
Thank you, Beth, and really a pleasure to speak about this, as you said, really present topic. I think this is it has been a progress in a while, so I think it's, I'm happy to share it with you, but it's also a yes where we need to discuss also about the still present challenges in this field, because that's why we cannot see it even now, the systematic updating. I think here maybe a little bit of let's say presentation or a little bit of information for our audience about the healthcare sector. I know it's it may be known, but just a few figures for starting. I think the healthcare sector is important to mention that it generates about 30% of the world data volume, and yet I think out of that about 97, so maybe majority of it, let's say, remains unused. And that's because it's often silos, it's regulated, and no common standards and for connected healthcare services. And we saw in the first panel, and I was really looking very carefully about what the mentions were in the policy arena. There are several countries which already have begun to lay down the grounds for data-driven healthcare systems. And there is also an accelerated proliferation of smart technologies. We see that every day in our lives. And I think what it's also promising is that we saw recently a growing consensus that the health sector is, in particular, I would say, will be transformed by the collection, integration, and also sharing of personal health data. And that will for sure lead to what we are looking in the industry, let's say, an era of truly personalized healthcare. But here it comes the other side. I would say that the establishing the data sharing ecosystem requires that these processes happen at large scale, sharing of data that needs to be done across organizations and also institutions and geographies. So I think here this diverse group of stakeholders need to contribute to these data sets. And this really happens now. I mean, still continues to happen in operational in silos. So without what we see without policies, frameworks, and infrastructure that will consistent or make consistency in high quality data, this is really not really something that can happen. And also, I think it's important to speak a little bit about the primary use of data and the secondary use of data, because we still discuss a lot about the secondary use, but what we see in our lives is that not the primary use of data is not well known, is not understood, is not, let's say, taken into consideration as it should be. And when I'm speaking in the healthcare about the primary use of data, I'm speaking, for example, about investigation, diagnostics, a lot of data sets that are generated for a specific patient that could support the patient's, let's say, journey and doing it a more personalized way. And here it's imaging, it's molecular, genomic, which is very sensitive, clinical data, and all sorts of other data which need to be aggregated, shared within a team of doctors. But it all needs a patient, let's say, consent, because it's patient data. So what is important is that there is a fundamental willingness by patients to share their data. And in my experience, the closer the use of their data is tied to a personal situation, then it's the more pronounced their willingness, let's say, to contribute to medical progress. And we've seen some statistics, and we were looking how that will place actually. And it's we saw that more than 60% of the patients really want to share their data with doctors. But we also were really positively surprised to see that more of 30% of the patients are willing to share their data with pharmaceutical companies, which you could not really believe it. But what is key here in this context is the transparency. And I also heard about this in the first panel, speaking about that the need of the patient or of the citizen to contribute to the bigger picture, but they want to know what is behind the scene. The resistance comes when the use of data is not in a non-transparent, is done in the non-transparent way. And here I think it's the really key point, the important point. And when it comes to healthcare, majority of the citizens in the healthcare environment, let's say, are concerned about the privacy, data security, and also about the cost of healthcare. And you asked about the latest progress. Yes, there were various examples, bigger, smaller, various countries. And here I think it was worth mentioning one of the biggest initiatives which is done at the European level, which is the IMI, which is Innovative Medicine Initiative, Big Data for Better Outcomes program, which is the world's largest at the moment public-private partnership in life sciences. It's more than 3.5 million euros, I think, or and that has various programs under it. Then I think it's worth to say about the patient data. Yes, it's a privilege for us and for anyone to work with patient data. And we need to treat it really with respect, I'd say, protection, ensure protection and of patient privacy, and prevent any unauthorized access. And speaking about the secondary use of data, What I can say is that we as a company share clinical data because we really understand it helps the physicians, patients, and healthcare providers to make informed treatment decisions. Data sharing, it enables, of course, researchers to be more to do the research more easily and to also build on our research and research for others as well in the hope of advancing scientific progress. In the past, let's say we've taken, similar to other industry members, we've taken steps to advance how we share our clinical research, both within the scientific community and also with the broader public. And for now, I think we can share that our data is made available or shared in at least 4 different ways. We publish information on our protocols, we disclose clinical studies documentation, we publish peer-reviewed journals and share data in scientific meetings, and we provide qualified researchers access to individual patient data. But I know we feel that we do a lot of, we try to make a lot of progress, and we also know that it's a lot of room, and we acknowledge that our work is far from being complete, but we are committed to continue, and together with also other partners of for the industry, we try to do it as much as possible. We also know what's next. I don't know if that's the time now to share what our view is, but I'll let maybe the others and share more.
That sounds wonderful. Let's bring everybody into the conversation. And let me say to everybody here, there will be plenty of time, we hope, for conversation among you and also responses to questions that people post in the Q&A. So with that, let me, before coming to you, Peter, encourage people to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions that you have or follow-up that you would like to see. I know I have several questions for you, but I want to come over to Peter for a moment and to ask you specifically about Place Data Trust, which is a very unique kind of data collaborative as a nonprofit legal trust that tries to serve as a trusted intermediary in this space. And so I'm hoping, especially to connect some of what Ioana is saying about policies to the practices that you engage in, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the rationale behind Place Data Trust and whether you see it as a model that other people can follow in what context or not follow in others. So Peter, over to you. And again, we'll put your bio in the chat as we go along.
Oh, thanks, Beth, and thanks, everyone. So just a couple of setting things. When we talk about mapping or geospatial data, they're interchangeable terms. There are really 2 ways to think about it. One is individual location data or mapping data, such as you might create every day by using your phone and moving around. And the other is the capture of information about the Earth's surface and what's below the Earth's surface through different types of sensors, things like cameras and satellite, different types of satellite scanners and so forth, and even in-place scanners that register when people move backwards and forwards. And of course, as a geographer, I'm entirely biased. I think geography drives everything that we do, and it's so influential in the decisions we've made, why we build things where we do, why we live where we do, and so forth. But actually, it's a fundamental driver of many of today's big tech businesses. If you took away location from, and I know we have Microsoft and Meta on the call, but from those companies and from Apple, I think they'd find it very difficult to operate in the ways that they do. So location is essential. But for much of the world, developing world, what is a public good, that is mapping about what's happening in that country, has failed. And it's failed for a number of reasons, and I won't go into it. And you have many tech platforms that use mapping data to enhance their real business. So it's not their fundamental business, but they need that data in order to supplement what they are doing as a business. So we saw an opportunity to try and sit in between and try to deliver a failed public good. And I think anyone who's been in business knows that you can't build a viable business trying to replace a public good. It just doesn't work. So non-profit, number one, because the financial model really didn't allow us anything else. The second is that we knew from early on we had to build trust. If we're going to be an intermediary, then the different players in the market space would have to trust us as the intermediary. The government would have to trust us, and potentially those that would make use of the data that we were going to collect had to also trust us. And we felt by being a nonprofit, that would help in one regard. Although interestingly enough, being a nonprofit with big commercial entities is not a good thing if you're producing a product, because they don't always think you can produce the product on time and with the quality they would desire. And also, there's a realization, Beth, in the construct that despite the fact that a Google, for example, will spend many tens of millions of dollars a year acquiring geospatial data from every place they can, they actually don't want to be a mapper. And they're not that interested in acquiring data for economies that aren't that well developed or don't have a lot of activity. And so you get data deserts being created. And let's say Google owns 30% of the location data market by acquiring all this geospatial data. They also realize they can't get to scale. It's too expensive to get 100% of mapping the world, and it's not their core business. Their business is doing something with that base data, and that's true of their competitors. So we said, well, what if we set up a club good that is a good that is needed by many competitors that the marketplace doesn't allow the efficiency to occur, but we would create a good that they all need but doesn't compete with the business they have and want to do. And so we defined our good as very, very low level, very high resolution, detailed aerial imagery captured from the air, and street imagery, think Google Street View. And we would make that available to a club. We would guide with governance and ethical use of data through terms and conditions of joining the club, that data, and we would not create any derived works. We would allow our community to create and benefit from the derived works from the good that we helped collect. And I'll stop here because there's many other governance instruments that we've implemented. Licensing is absolutely key and essential and is often overlooked with data that we've implemented to try and make this club good around very primary mapping data available. So let me stop there, Beth.
Thank you. Maybe let me just ask you a very, very quick follow-up. And again, encourage people as we go along, per Andrew's comment, feel free to type reactions or additional comments in the chat, which is open to everybody. But any questions for our panel, please keep those in the Q&A so we can see them when we get into the conversation. But Peter, let me just ask you, is there one question more than others that you get from companies or from governments when you're trying to work with them? Is it about trust? Is it about this issue of being able to deliver a product and reliability? What's kind of the one thing that you hear the most that you would say is the impediment to people moving forward with collaboration?
So on the government side, there is no cost to government. We sign an MOU. We only ever work in a country where we've signed an MOU because provenance is key from the commercial side. We need to be able to show that MOU and that license that we have legitimacy to collect and to license on the data. So there's no cost to the government. They have to provide certain in-kind contributions, which are significant for us as an outsider if I was to have to do that. I won't go into the technical details. So when we present the model, the number one question the governments ask after we present it, or the number one statement from them is, it sounds too good to be true. The second question is, there's a catch, but I just don't see it. You guys are clever. And the third is, because I'm based in Washington, D.C., you guys work for the CIA. So that's the sequence we get with the government every time. On the commercial side, it's like, we show the data, we show technically that we can do the work, and then they say, well, call us when you have enough data in your vault. So the impediment to getting commercial licensing legitimately is you need more data, and you need data in key cities. And no surprise, do you have Lagos? Do you have Nairobi? Do you have Joburg? Right? And that really starts, because our goal is to be self-funding, through the licensing of those data sets to the large companies that are willing to pay to own all the derived works they create from our data. And as a nonprofit, it allows me to potentially sell Nairobi multiple times in order that I can do a Monrovia for which there's no demand. All right, so it allows me to sort of cross-subsidize where there's high development demand, but very little economic demand.
Very interesting. Well, you'll have to tell us afterwards if the CIA does have any interest in all this data. So, but maybe we won't have time.
They have
for
no
that.
interest in the trust, but they have interest in the data for sure.
That I'm sure. So, apropos of more data, Jed, this is something that you've written about quite eloquently. I'm going to put your recent article, your blog post, in the chat here. So let me bring you into this conversation to explain to us what you wrote about there. You wrote about several challenges to the concept of open data and the desire for us to focus on more data. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about Radiant Earth and what you're up to and what you meant by that.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, we wrote this blog post called "We Don't Talk About Open Data." I'm a little bit late. I was trying to sort of capitalize on the whole "we don't talk about Bruno" phenomenon. Doesn't have quite the same ring to it, but the idea is the same: is that we avoid talking about open data. We feel like it's a distraction at this point at Radiant. Our job at Radiant historically has been to improve access to satellite data, and so the volume of data that we work with really sort of informs our thinking about open data, because we deal in petabyte scale data sets. And when you're dealing with, let's say, a petabyte of data or even a terabyte of data, very few people have capacity to download that much data. They don't have that much storage available to them on their laptop. If you've got a good broadband connection, it'll take you about 5 years to download a petabyte of data. So to say that you've made a petabyte of data open is effectively meaningless for most people. And this got stuck in my mind, this notion that openness is actually like very poorly defined. And so one of the things I address in the blog post is this notion of the open definition, which somebody has come up with a definition of open in terms of open data. Which is that it's data that's freely available for anyone to use for any purpose, at most asking for attribution in return. And I think it's a fine definition, but ultimately it's not very useful for a lot of data products. And so what I've come around to, based on our work at Radiant, and then also previously when I was at AWS running the Open Data Program, was that a really useful way to think about data and talk about data is to talk in terms of data products. And it's a very slight, it's a little minimalist trick you can do, is just add the word product to the conversation when you're talking about data, and it completely changes the conversation. Because if you're thinking about data products, you're thinking about what they're for, who the user is, what they might do with it. And another really important consideration is you consider the cost of the product. How much does it cost to produce it? How much does it cost to maintain it and distribute it? If you're dealing in spreadsheets, and your open data is actually just sort of a byproduct of existing processes that dump out spreadsheets that you can put on the web, the cost might be so small that you don't even want to think about it. It's not worth thinking about. When you're talking about a satellite, the decision is far different, right? You're thinking about what is the cost to build, fly, operate the satellite, and then distribute that data, where the bandwidth costs actually add up to something very significant. You really have to think about the cost. And so that's why we don't talk about open data. I think it's too facile. I think it's somewhat of a sloppy term. And so thinking about data products is quite a bit better. There will be instances, like I said, if you're dealing with spreadsheets, or even other larger data sets, when as a society, we might determine that it makes sense to have certain data products to be freely available to everybody. They're so valuable, they're so broadly useful that we should make them as open as possible, because it's going to drive a lot of economic growth or otherwise facilitate innovation. Weather data is frequently an example of this, that makes a lot of sense. The trick, though, is that it is still very hard to measure the impact of those things. I was glancing at the reevaluating open data, this paper that was rethinking the impact of open data paper. One of the challenges of sort of the previous definition of open data, or this idea that data should just be open, available for anyone for any purpose, is that if you do that the right way, you're not really going to know who's using your data. It's going to be very hard to measure who's using it if you're not asking people for information, about who's accessing it. One metaphor I use in those cases for like evaluating the impact is road networks. So like actual like road infrastructure. We tend to all agree that it makes sense to have good road infrastructure. Measuring the impact of functioning roads is almost impossible, right? But we know they're very, very useful, and we agree to pay taxes and have those maintained as a public good because it's so broadly useful. And I think the same thing applies to a lot of data products, but not all data. And so once again, I think thinking in terms of data products that are worth maintaining and worth the cost is the way to go here. I think we're coming out of, let's say, a decade or so of a lot of thinking that like if we just open up data, lots of people will do stuff with it, and all data should be open. I think that's just a little bit too abstract to be useful, and so that's why we talk about data products.
Extremely helpful. I'm reminded of when I was in the Obama administration, one of the ways we started our first data collaborative was because we couldn't open up data lest people hit our servers and try to download that corpus of patent data. For example, it would have crashed the entire office, and in fact it did, which is why we started collaborating with industry, because we just didn't even have the infrastructure to put that data on as the owner, let alone as the person downloading it. I'm hearing, by the way, lots of questions for one another. You're talking about kind of these hidden costs, if you will, that open isn't free. And Peter is talking about data deserts, and Ioana has brought in another set of issues. So I want to encourage you also to start thinking about questions for one another as we move forward. But let me just ask you a quick follow-up here, which is anything that you've talked about making some key data sets that we really think need to be truly accessible, more, let's call them truly accessible and usable to people. Are there specific things that you've seen, like one thing that you would recommend that can really bring down that cost for people? And is it on the kind of product side, or is it more on the governance side that you would see as being sort of one of the most important things we need to do? We can get into longer discussion after. So just a quick thought here.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, the way you phrase the question is really interesting, because I think you can't have a good product without good governance. People are going to want to know that the data is accurate and reliable, and where it's coming from. I wouldn't even call it a framework, but like one way I would think about, but like what does a good data product like have? Like what makes a good data product? I think it needs to be reliably available. I think it needs to be well documented. And I think people need to sort of trust where it came from. And it doesn't go much further beyond that. I think a lot of people get sort of wrapped around the axle working on bespoke APIs or special interfaces or analytical tools when sharing data. In my experience, you can just get data out the door using, and also just so you know, like I spent a lot of time at AWS, so I'm very influenced by this, but cloud-based object storage, it doesn't have to be AWS, but it could be any of the object stores on any of the major cloud providers. They allow you to make just about any volume of data available over HTTP in a very performant way. And in my experience, that solves maybe 90% of use cases, is just giving people objects in an object store that they can reliably access. You don't need to go much further than that. But you need good documentation, you need good governance, and all these sorts of things that aren't cheap, and that are really important and hard to think about. So I'd say focus on those things rather than the interfaces and the delivery mechanism, because the delivery mechanism's almost solved for most use cases.
Great. Let's go over to Gretchen and hear if she agrees whether we've solved the delivery mechanism. And so we wanted to come back, in some ways connected to Jed's point about good governance, because Microsoft has really been leading and thinking about this concept of data stewardship. And so I really wanted to bring you into the conversation here and ask you about sort of the practices that you have found useful in terms of governance and data stewardship, and how Microsoft has approached this notion of governing and, more importantly, sustaining and institutionalizing open data or more data, public access to data over time.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Beth, for the question. And it's great to be here as part of the panel. And as you say, I mean, it is a challenge to think about what that coordinating function looks like when it comes to data stewardship. You mentioned at the outset, I sit in a team called the Open Innovation Team, which is in our intellectual property group at Microsoft. And in 2020, we launched an open data campaign. And the aim of that was really to highlight the need for open data, but also to explore how we could help make the process of opening data and sharing data easier, because it's challenging in many ways around the governance, around the motivations behind working together with data. So a lot of that exploration we did was sort of that learning by doing and being involved in data collaborations, understanding what the hurdles were, what was a useful way for us to engage to help overcome them, that type of thing. So we learned a lot and have been able to take some of that and have since established within Microsoft an Office of Open Data. So this is sits within our Open Innovation team, and essentially it is that data stewardship function. And we're able to serve as essentially like a central unit within the company, where people can come and ask questions around either reusing data or releasing data for innovation, where we can provide guidance and hopefully over time be able to do that faster. And overall, we're just aiming to reduce the barriers to innovating with data and to do so responsibly. So we have this office. Some of the functions are that we do provide guidance to our business on open data, innovating with open data. We provide trainings and recognition programs to really be able to recognize data scientists, data developers, and others who are working to make data open. I think it's GovLab has used the term of like the name and fame, and that is something that we want to do. We really want to highlight and feature those who are putting the work behind assembling data and making it available, in particular for social good purposes. And so very practically, like we have some tooling where we can maintain sort of and understand what are common when it comes to data reuse, what are common data sets and their uses. We can hopefully enable faster reuse and sort of run reporting on different scenarios. So that's a lot of what we do within this Office of Open Data. And externally too, so this is kind of how we provide guidance internally, externally too. When we were doing a lot of this work through this open data campaign, when we launched it, we just in talking to other companies, like just discovered that so many companies are on a similar journey, and thinking about how to make data more open, more accessible, in particular for societal good. And just realized to a certain extent that we could have more impact by doing this work with others. So late last year, we are a co-founder along with 6 other organizations of a partnership called the Industry Data for Society Partnership that launched in December last year. And that's centered around a set of commitments that we all made to make private sector data more open and accessible. And we did feel like there was space. There are several public-private partnerships, but this is specifically for industry to come together and say, how can we progress open data with the private sector, and how can we share across sectors, best practices, and that sort of thing. So that's been more recent, but is exciting to think about how we can progress private sector data and work on a program of work together to highlight the value that can come from making data more accessible. So yeah, that's how we've kind of been thinking about the data stewardship function at Microsoft, that all of that work is done within this Office of Open Data. And I think it has been helpful to kind of establish a place, and we can serve also that coordinating function where if, for example, somebody wants to work with data, release data that maybe has privacy implications, we have a privacy team and we can make that connection. If there's a data set that's related to AI, we can make a connection with our Office of Responsible AI where that makes sense. So we can also serve that function and make it easy for people that are looking to release data or reuse data in some capacity. But yeah, that's a little bit about where we've been in our journey.
Very quickly, Gretchen, in terms of the impediments that you've seen, it's been 3 years now since you've had this open data campaign running at Microsoft. Is the number one kind of impediment or doubt or that single question that you get most from people how to protect privacy and how to do this in a responsible way? Or are the solutions that you've described a response to a different question or challenge that you tend to see? And Ioana, I'm going to want to come back and ask you that too, because this privacy of data, is this the central question or is it something else? Is it just start with why should we do this? What's the number one question that you see?
It's a good question. Number one question, I mean, a lot of it has been, I guess what we've learned along the way is it's easy to jump to discussions around the data and what the data is, how to make the data accessible. But there are so many questions we've learned that really should be spent more time on the front end. Like, what are we trying to achieve with this data? Like, what is the goal that we're working towards? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And especially with data collaborations, like coming to consensus around that. And I think through that exercise, it's a way to both make sure that we're all pointed in the same direction of what we want to achieve with this collaboration, but also to build trust in the process. I mean, that establishing trust is really key, and it enables us to understand what people's motivations are for engaging, and how we can best govern a collaboration. So some of those questions on the front end might really be the most common questions. Some of the tools we put in place, I would say a little bit, are more around a lot of these collaborations we took part in were so bespoke. And sometimes that's hard to, I mean, they just are. And sometimes you do need to have a certain data use agreement if you want to share data in a certain way or certain parameters to think about that. But there are also, the more we can identify sort of these common uses or common questions, I think the more that we can answer those quickly and start to scale the work that we do. And that's been both a challenge and something I think we made some progress on, but can do more, is like, how do we move a little more from everything is so bespoke to how can we just do some of this work a little faster, more efficiently, and be able to do it at a little bit of a greater scale. So that's some of the, I guess, thinking behind some of the work we've done to actually put in place a process or processes so that we can do that more effectively and efficiently.
Fantastic. Let's connect this to Laura and what she's seeing at Meta, where similarly you've had the Data for Good initiative now for a number of years, and very curious whether you're seeing things similar to Gretchen, or has the function of Data for Good and data collaboration been institutionalized in a different way for you, and what have the lessons been that you've learned towards making data more, opening data up in a more sustainable and systematic way?
Thanks so much, Beth and Gretchen. It's really nice to have the previous panelists sort of tee up. I'm actually getting so excited by what different people are going to say that I'm trying to make sure I don't start too many threads at once. But to pick up on what Gretchen was saying about, how do we evaluate common use cases as opposed to bespoke sort of interests of maybe one academic at a time? I think it relates really strongly to Jed's point about, talking about data as like an input and the value of open data in general. I mean, I often like to remind people that data is it's a synonym for information. It's just structured information. And somehow when we use that word, things that would normally seem really nonsensical to talk about, like the value of information, like you would just not get people together to talk about that because the variety of applications is so wide. And even in our community, I have to say, I mean, like the amount of open data conferences I'm sure we've all been to, when you think about it in the context of that's just structured information, it's kind of silly, right? Like you could have somebody who's working with satellite imagery to solve issues related to deforestation in a sort of coffee break with, a healthcare professional trying to figure out how we speed research and sort of fighting cancer. And it's like, yeah, these people have basically nothing in common with the exception of the fact that they need better information to do their work, which is pretty much the entire human race. So I think the more we can move out of the bespoke and into the specific by treating data as an input, and then we build products exactly like Jed said, with data sets. And they're very like well-oiled processes that you can follow if anyone's not read the Lean Startup. Like good product management, we know how to do it, particularly in the private sector at tech companies. You have to get out of the building, you have to talk to your users. And when you start to get more specific, you start to realize either that maybe one researcher has like one idea, but if maybe 5 researchers have a problem in common, that's the kind of thing we want to build for. So we do not build for individuals. We build for communities, we build for ecosystems, we build data products that you can scale to thousands of users all at once. And that dovetails to, I'd say something that we've learned along the way in Data for Good at Meta, in that we did start actually as a program that worked only with nonprofits and researchers, and you had to sign data license agreements to collaborate with our team. And it really was during the early onset of the COVID-19 pandemic where we realized that was just not going to scale. We had tons of governments around the world that wanted to use our data sets. We had tons of commercial entities that were trying to collaborate on things like recommendation of data-driven policy, in partnership with governments around the world. So I'd say starting in around 2020, we made a huge push for open source. And we've taken a really strong approach of incorporating things like differential privacy into our data sets, really taking the burden of privacy protection on ourselves. We're lucky because we have some of the most talented data scientists and privacy engineers at companies like Meta. And so we can really do the red teaming on our side, do sufficient aggregation, sufficient adding of noise. Again, you always want to make sure that those sort of statistical outputs of the model you're not adding so much noise that you make the data set not usable. But very often, if you're talking about solving real policy or public health or natural disaster response use cases, you really don't need to be sharing individual or sort of even that disaggregated information. People just want answers to questions about, are people staying at home on a county level? Or in our case, what are the social connections between places where people are fleeing in Ukraine and other parts of Europe, and how can we use that to forecast migration? So we try to be very good stewards of like a good product development lifecycle. We get out of the building, we talk to our users in groups. We try to make sure that we're not just treating all of our data users as this vast ecosystem of people with disparate interests. If we want to build a healthcare product, we build for that set of users. If we want to build a product for natural disaster response, we build to that set of users. Another thing we've learned is that a good product, this is like another industry, I think, saying you don't just solve a headache, you're trying to solve a migraine. So one of the biggest things that we've learned through the process is that sometimes we need to be focusing on the very, very basic gaps in information to solve problems around the world. Like our most popular data set, which we worked with Jed for many years to open source through Amazon's Open Data Registry, are high resolution population density maps. What problem do those solve? Where are people? We use census information combined with satellite imagery. We identify structures in the satellite imagery to provide basically more fine grained resolution to where people are, by basically saying like, okay, it's not just this county of people that has 10,000 children under 5, it's this tiny square, and we see a house there. And so if you're doing something like a vaccine distribution, the people who are going house to house to either provide the vaccines or canvas to provide information have a much more clear picture on where it's likely that children under 5 are living. And so that's a very, very basic question. I know that we say the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Yeah, perhaps in the developed world, we've gotten to a place where we feel like we know everything about everywhere, but guess what? Even here in the United States, our census information is incomplete. Lots of people don't get counted in the US Census every 10 years. We still have very basic sort of migraine level data problems and information problems that we need to solve for. And so I try to be very basic, very sort of specific, and I try to treat the community of people that work with our program as our users, as our clients. And we try to build for sort of communities of them at once. And then again, sort of take the work of privacy protection, putting things like differential privacy into our data sets at the outset so that you can share things in an open format in a way that can be scaled to as many users at once as possible. And we feel very lucky we've been able to do that a ton throughout COVID-19 response, activating very heavily for things like the war in Ukraine, most recently the earthquake in Turkey, and now doing a lot more data products around the value of social connections for things like economic mobility. So we're learning every 6 months to a year a new tool in the toolbox. But I think staying at this and trying to again treat our users like our clients and keep things as open as possible has been the route that we've chosen to go.
So I want to open things up for discussion. First and foremost, for you of one another. And as you're thinking about whether you'd like to react to one another or ask questions of one another, I just want to pick up a quick point that you made, Laura. You referred a lot to COVID and now to Ukraine and other crises. And I'm just wondering whether to you or to others, whether the passing of the pandemic moment, thankfully, from a public health perspective, has taken the wind out of the sails in any of your work. Again, not that any of us would wish for this to come back or that we want more wars or crises, but I'm just curious whether how the COVID moment has affected the work that you do, if at all.
I'm happy to sort of take that. I mean, I
Sure.
think
Yeah, we can follow up on it.
So I come from a development background, and I remember when I was taking a class on monitoring and evaluation, people were talking about these two peaks of interest during a development project. There's like a ton of money when you build your strategic plan, and then a ton of money when you do your 5 to 10 year impact evaluation. And like almost no one is like paying attention when the work is actually going on, when you should be monitoring, which we know is not as sexy as doing like, a big impact assessment. And so what I would say is, even though we had a ton of impact during COVID, and our program was in the news a lot, sometimes it's when things are not as like sexy and as in the news, when like I don't want to say the real, there's always real work going on. But I'm more proud of our program now than ever, just because we're getting better every year that we're at this. And so, yes, are we, having our data sets used at the same scale by governments around the world when they were, when everyone was using non-traditional mobility data to better understand adherence to lockdown orders? I don't think the scale is the same as it was during the COVID-19 pandemic. But to use migraine analogy, the migraines were just so big. The information, when people introduced non-pharmaceutical interventions, the two big ones, stay home, wear masks, there was no data on either one of those things. Those are not traditional public health responses. It's not like your pediatrician knows like the rate of people who are staying home or whether or not people in your community are wearing masks. So I would just say, the migraines were bigger in terms of need for information. They had to come from non-traditional sources. It was, I think, front and center of everyone's mindset at the time. But just because, it's not in front and center of everyone's sort of attention right now, it doesn't mean that the work of non-traditional data as part of operational response isn't as important now more than ever. Again, we activated very heavily for the Turkey response, which was only a couple of months ago. And there's an ongoing recovery effort there that we have to be involved in, and sharing information to be helpful to that. So I think you're right, just from a sort of public attention perspective, but I think maybe from an impact perspective, I continue to see it every day in the work I do.
So let me open it up to anyone here, whether it's a response to my question or a comment to one another. I think, Ioana, you've unmuted. Please, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a little bit also on the COVID topic, because maybe we were a little bit closer to the topic in the healthcare environment, let's say. And we can say that, yes, that the pandemic really showed that the limitations of the healthcare infrastructure, and it was impossible to ignore, and forced somehow the systems around the world to really recognize the critical role of this comprehensive, I'd say, health data, let's say, in the operational related. And also that we saw also that there was a need for the data integration in a way that was never before. Whether we lose the capabilities that were built or not during this time, I think it was a great momentum for uptaking the skills and everything that was done. But I think that now we may lose this capability that were built. And this is not because we don't have a crisis and everyone reacting in a crisis better than in a normal situation. Is that we were forced at the time that the policies maybe were different. We had different scenarios. Everyone saw the purpose that everything was that was done for a purpose. It was transparent in a way that everything was working. Everyone was working together to achieve a common goal. But when now we have a different kind of topic and the crisis is not here, we are normalized and everything, we face the same challenges, which were really easily overcome during that period. So really coming down to this really day by day challenges and coming again for the similar topics in a different environment. But here it's maybe a wish that the ones that really showed really seen a different, really learned from what it was improved and what they can do, keep the same processes and implement it even and develop further. The ones that don't act, it's a problem there. That's back to you.
So now let me open it up to all of you. If there's any two-finger interventions, responses to one another, things that resonated, things you want to object to, or otherwise, and then I'm going to weave in some of the questions we have from our audience. Jed, please.
Well, yeah, actually, I have a question for Laura that sort of answers one of the questions that's in the Q&A, which the first question from Zaidul about, is there a lack of trust in open data produced by private sector versus government? And what I'm curious about is Meta's data products are incredible. Like I would say, in terms of people that we'd worked with at AWS, the quality was just astonishing, really, in terms of those products. Why does Meta do it? We opened up some data when AWS data and Amazon data that we hosted through our program. For the most part, our program hosted public sector data that they wanted to put on the cloud. But we would open up data, and oftentimes it was for recruiting purposes. So we put out a huge computer vision data set because we wanted to accelerate the state of research in computer vision and hopefully find researchers that we could hire. That was kind of the explicit state. And the reason I'm phrasing this in terms of Zaidul's question is that it's really important to understand what is the intention behind the data product? What is the provider trying to get out of it? If you know that they have an explicit goal, in my case, in my experience, I've seen it helps people trust the data more because they understand what it's intended for. So I'm just curious to get Laura, how do you explain Meta's justification or rationale for doing what it does so well?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's sort of two different ways in which we share data. I think one is, something starts as having a commercial purpose, and then either the research scientist or the product manager who's working on that goes holy. In the case of the population density maps that we shared on AWS, those were built for connectivity reasons. So, back when we were spending tons and tons of money to try to bring connectivity infrastructure in the developing world, we, as our own sort of practitioners of an infrastructure project, realized the population data was really poor. We were we can do better. We can use satellite imagery. We came up with an amazing AI model. And then through that process, the team working on that was we may have just created the most accurate population density maps in the world. This is crazy. We need to share this with the outside world because we shouldn't be the only ones benefiting from it. So I'd say about half of our data products start with some sort of internal business use case. And then we realize almost by accident that we created something that also had amazing social impact in terms of its other applications. I don't even want to say secondary use. It's they have more social impact than we could have ever, anticipated by doing it ourselves. And then I think the program as a whole, we just realized that, we have to put our money where our mouth is. Obviously, large tech companies, people are at times uncomfortable with the fact that we have a lot of data. And so we've always thought that when we can share data in a privacy preserving way back with the community for its own benefit, that makes the data that we have that much more powerful. And hopefully people sort of trust our business as a result more through those sorts of partnerships.
Peter, please chime in.
Thanks. And pick up on Jed, I'm very much in agreement with data products. I don't think we speak enough about how much bad open data there is out there. And it just consumes much of the open data space, and it just, I think, sinks people and they don't even bother anymore. They just give up. But I'd like to come back to this whole notion of private sector data and maybe push a bit on Gretchen and Laura. Our approach has been treat commercial entities as what they are, commercial entities, and their job is to make profits, and their job is to service shareholders and markets. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, we believe that our data should encourage not just corporates, but also local companies to build businesses of value and hire people and make money. Absolutely fine. And I think the 3.0, 3.1 movement is a movement away from ideology around the open early open data sets. But I think this expectation that companies are doing it because it's the right thing, they're doing it because it's good for their businesses. And it's either because they can find inferences, or they can harvest other information to make their own products better, which is absolutely fine, or it's for reputation management. And one only has to look at budgets around open data for good, CSR, ESG, and it's the whole same swirling world to me. And I would rather have a more honest conversation to say, if Meta's going to make use of this data to make their business better, fine. If I don't like the Meta business, then I won't become a user of Meta. That's my choice. I can do that. But I think it's a more honest conversation, as opposed to we have to have access to these big corporate data sets because it's the right thing to do. Those things just don't go anywhere. And you only have to look at ESG and CSR for the last 20 years to show that these are defensive mechanisms. And so I think we need a more robust conversation. And it's great that Microsoft and Meta are here. And I always want them as part of the conversation. I want them to benefit from what we're doing. I'd just rather have an honest conversation about why and how they should share data.
Any reaction or response to that? And I mean, we've heard a little bit also, Peter, about recruiting. So it's beneficial from a corporate perspective, but that can come in some different forms. And I'm wondering whether you or others sort of see those secondary, recruiting, retention, or other strategies as being sort of part of that honest message. And I wonder whether Laura or Gretchen or Ioana want to respond here.
I mean, I can certainly just speak from experience that it does have a very positive impact on retention. And that's not an explicit goal of the Data for Good program, but time and time again, I've been at Meta for about 6 years. People say, like, this is the best part of my job. This makes me proud to work for this company. I think that that goes a long way. Even sometimes when we have research scientists who don't work full time with our team, even allowing an engineer to work 10 hours a week on something like an open source data set that's going to be used by nonprofits around the world is really good for their motivation, and that's good for long-term retention. So I think certainly anecdotally, we can speak to the positive sort of internal gains that people make by working on programs like ours. And I totally take your point, Peter. I think we are our goal is to be transparent, and there are ways in which we've, for example, collaborated with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap in the past, getting feedback on things like our population density maps. But the explicit goal of my program really is for the benefit of sort of nonprofits, governments, and researchers around the world, because we do think that better partnership with institutions like those around the world long term is the best thing for our business. I don't know, Gretchen, if you have further thoughts.
I would echo much of that, and I guess, just speak to some of the scenarios I'm familiar with, which is also that releasing data can help with innovation. A lot of data is released alongside research. So it's very much I think can help with innovation, which obviously is at the core as a business too, of what we're trying to advance. And some things too, like a data set that Microsoft released was around broadband use in the US. So just by deploying our services, we can understand broadband use across the US through the deployment of our services. And we were able to create a data set and put that through differential privacy so that there was reduced any risk of identifying households or anything like that, and release that data set on GitHub. And I think that's also informative to policymakers as they're making decisions around broadband, that this was a very good and accurate data set that could complement some of the work that they're doing. So I think a variety of different reasons to open data, and a lot of that is around research and innovation.
Peter, do you feel that, do you want to keep pushing on what you're seeing in terms of the kind of sincerity? And I don't mean to question the sincerity of anybody on this panel, but sort of from a corporate perspective, either Jed or Peter here, do you want to come in on sort of what you're seeing as being the kind of underlying motives? And or this gets back to, Jed, a question you asked us earlier, which is about how people measure impact, would be another way of putting this.
Yeah. Peter, do you want to go first? I've got some.
Yeah, let me just, so I'm not questioning motives. In fact, I'm saying we should explicitly state the motives. We've talked a lot about trust. Trust is essential. And a lot of companies don't always have great trust for what they do. And so these can certainly be mechanisms to help gain trust, whether positively or negatively, however you want to view it. I'm not questioning motives. These are big, large, influential companies, and they do what they do. And I'm not here to pass judgment, from an ideological standpoint. My whole background's out of the private sector. I've happened to select a nonprofit status because I think that's our most likely path to success. But I think the expectations that people put on companies like Meta and Microsoft are usually unreasonable because they think they should open up the whole locker of the data they have. On the other hand, I think the companies can actually help themselves by saying, listen, we're doing this for a multitude of reasons, whatever. And that may not fly, because I could imagine Gretchen having to go to her boss and say, my whole position here, I've got to make bolder statements. So I completely get the answers. I think the point is made. And I think the more important point is that whoever's going to have success around open data and extracting data sets out of private sector is going to have to be much more practical and much more accepting of private sector gains as a result of the use of the data, and just simply be open to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's what we've tried to do, both with our licensing scheme and how we're inviting people into the box. We just have to get away from this viewpoint of everything should be made available that has extreme IP value to companies and other things. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks, Beth.
Jed, before you respond, I want to encourage all of our panel to take a look at the open questions in the Q&A, because there are a number that have come in. So Jed, why don't you give us a quick response, and then I'll invite people to, there's some specific things directed at specific people, so we'll invite you to chime in and respond, or I'll moderate those in a second. Okay. Jed, over to you.
Yeah, just really quick. I just want to riff one more time on this question of trust, because I just do think it's very important for people to be explicit about their intentions and motivations because of this. And so, which is what Peter just said. But I'll just tell you, I can tell a little story about AWS. Like, we created this thing called the Amazon Sustainability Data Initiative years back, which was basically like an evolution of the open data program, but specifically focused on sustainability. Part of the rationale for that was justified internally by people's concerns about Trump coming into office, and the fear that there was this news cycle about how Trump was going to destroy a lot of environmental data, which wasn't really true. I mean, like, it wasn't possible for him to destroy government information, but there was this concern that he would restrict access to it. And so I highlight this to point out that, like, the public sector also like has a tenuous grasp on trust. Democracies are fragile. I mean, also by design, like they're designed to change leadership over time and change priorities over time. And so I think this problem of trust is also something that's like never solved. Like you're always going to have to continue to earn and maintain trust, whether you're coming from the public sector or private sector. And yeah, and just to reiterate, I think it's just very important to be explicit and honest about motivations to do that. So I'll stop there.
So now let me see, there's a bunch of things that have come in the Q&A. There's one that I want to ask of all of you around AI. So I want to hold that at the for a second. And just first to tackle some of the specific things, there's a question in the chat around differential privacy, specifically directed to Laura, but I'm wondering if anyone else wants to take that question. And given that our audience probably can't see the Q&A, I'm not sure if you can. There's a question here about how you manage differential privacy. As this requires use case specific approaches, how does one certify this is the way the question is phrased. So again, the privacy question here, and see if anyone wants to take this. It was directed to you, but others may have a view on sort of how you're thinking about privacy.
Sure. I mean, so for those familiar with differential privacy, there's kind of like levers that are pulled based on the power that one individual observation does or does not add to a data set. So in differential privacy, you're basically trying to make something like re-identification impossible while keeping the output of a model statistically the same as it would be were you not adding noise. And so depending on the level of aggregation of the data set, depending on how many observations are on the data set, you're not going to add the same amount of noise to, a hugely aggregated mobility data set to potentially something that was, more close to record level. So at the risk of not giving a very helpful response, this is all a lot of math. We've open sourced and shared some of our approaches. I can share a blog in the chat on sort of how we approached adding differential privacy to things like mobility data during COVID-19 response. But the short answer is, sometimes you're able to achieve something like an epsilon of 1, which is sort of the gold standard on being completely airtight. And sometimes if you add too much noise to a data set, you make it kind of impossible to use and nobody wants that. And so you have to have a slightly higher epsilon, but it's going to be sort of context and statistics specific based on how many observations are in the data set and the level of aggregation you're starting with.
Anyone else want to weigh in here? Otherwise, I'll move us forward in some of we have a bunch of questions that have come in. First, let me know if you'd like to respond to something specific in the chat here. But we do have a question that I think is relevant to all of you, which is the impact of generative AI, or could be relevant to all of you, or how you see whether it's generative AI specifically or the awareness of AI that generative AI has created, because we're now finally aware of talking to our technology, and how you see that as being relevant here. Do these tools, do AI tools, more specifically generative AI tools, have an impact here as we think about access to private sector data? Or maybe the answer is no.
I can make a pitch here for regulators. Sorry to my because I'm in a nonprofit, so sorry to everybody in the private sector who has data they don't want to open up. But I think if we do have models emerging that are going to that we can't quite understand and that are going to be like mediating people's perception of reality, we should be able to see the receipts. Like we should be able to understand like what's training these things. I'm not saying all that underlying data should be open, but I think it should be available to regulators in some way. Like a lot of ChatGPT is based on data that's just been crawled off the internet. I've heard, I don't have like reliable sources on this, but that Common Crawl, which is an open data set that crawls the entire web, is a huge basis for ChatGPT. I think, I don't know. If I were a regulator, I'd be very concerned as these large language models start to become very influential, because they're just going to have a huge amount of control over how people see the world, how content is created, how people behave. And if we can't see what's going into the models, I think it's going to be potentially problematic. So I do foresee more data being forced open out of the commercial sector companies that run these things.
I would just also say that I think this community can be very helpful as we talk about sort of the pros and cons of what Jed is saying about opening up, for example, more training data, or even just open sourcing large language models themselves, which Meta has chosen to do. I think we sort of already in some ways had this debate when we talked about opening up privately held data for public good. Like, what are the risks associated with that, but what are the benefits? And I hope potentially we can leapfrog some of the risk mitigation approaches, some of the frameworks, and even just thinking through, over the last 15 years or longer that we've been talking about the pros and cons of making privately held or even publicly held data available to the public. I think you're going to see the same discourse play out with open sourcing things like generative AI models. And hopefully this community of people who's already been steeped in sort of what are the risks, what are the benefits, how do we align on an approach that sort of mitigates the risk to the extent possible that we can while maximizing the benefits for society. I hope that this community of thinkers and doers can sort of help the generative AI community maybe sort of start a little bit ahead, because I think a lot of the issues we're going to face in that space look very similar to the issues faced in the open data community.
And maybe just jumping in on one of the opportunities, and I think it speaks to a stat that was raised earlier and some that I've seen as well, which are when we were in the early days of our open data campaign, we found some research that, like, for companies themselves, 90% of data is stored and never accessed again, and companies only analyze about 1% of their data. So I do hope, with generative AI, that starts to change that trajectory, and we start to actually, companies can do more with their data and use more of their data and get more value out of their data and be able to ask questions of it. So I do think that that's an opportunity, and hopefully we do start to change that trajectory of using data.
Peter, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to add one, and I think Jed will probably jump on this, which is if there's a role for third parties like myself and Jed, and we're essentially trying to make up for a failed public good, which governments even in the developed world are finding it harder and harder to get budget share to maintain a lot of these things, and the pace of change is so fast. Somebody has to pay for these things, this middle ground. It has to get funded, and the way it typically gets funded is not really sensible, and it's certainly not sustainable. Just hit the wrong key. So the question is, when you have a common good like a Wikipedia, and it can be mined for language models, and there's tremendous private good which could be made of that, and it could be harmful. How do you, it's sort of like an unpriced negative externality, like air and water, right? How do you think about open data, which could be used for private purposes, having some sort of, and I hate to say this as a former business owner, but a tax to allow a neutral third party that everybody agrees should be there to sort of fund that trusted intermediary. And I think that would be really worth exploring, not now, but in a future dialogue around funding mechanisms, which also allow corporates to benefit from financially and privately to do their business. So Jed, you and I have sort of talked about this, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is why Peter and I get along really well. We like to geek out about this stuff, but it's like, yeah, I mean, I think people are like melting down around like Reddit charging a lot for its API access, and Twitter as well. And I'm just like, what made you think that like you should have free access to all this data that these companies produce? Reddit and Twitter produced really compelling products that got a lot of people to provide a lot of information to them. And I think it was, I think we're learning in hindsight that it was a mistake for them to give free API access to that content. So the fact that people are charging for it now is, uncomfortable, and actually, I mean, it's like destroying businesses that have been built on this. So I don't want to like take it lightly. But we're learning a hard lesson right now about this. And but the question remains, like, who pays? And I think we need to think about different business models for these sorts of things. One approach that we're looking at Radiant, we just announced a thing called Source Cooperative last month that we're in development of. But the model that I use for Source Cooperative is that of a cooperative utility. And so it's a place where people can publish data. It's a data publishing utility. And the idea is that everyone who needs to publish data should pay into a centralized, neutral service that allows them to do that, but that isn't trying to capture their data or lock them into anything. A cooperative utility, for those who aren't familiar with this concept, these frequently show up in rural areas where energy utilities won't set up shop because they're just too remote and the business isn't big enough. So farmers will get together and they'll build their own power plant and say, look, we all need power. Let's just like pitch in and we'll have a power plant that will give us the service we need at the lowest cost possible. I think the internet is so ripe for more cooperative business models like this, because you can instrument and measure usage so accurately and bill accordingly. So that's what we're thinking about here. But I think I will at this point say desperately in need of new business models to think about this, because existing markets and the public sector, I think, are consistently failed to make data useful as much as we'd like. So I'll say that.
So that gives me a chance to sort of do a final tour de table, and it's the conversation resonates incredibly. I think even on the government side, the early genesis of these policies around open government and open data, if I had understood as well then what I understand now, that for many people, that concept of open was about that must have and nice to have, instead of really thinking practically, which is something that I think we've been making up for the last 10 years and really trying to create an emphasis on doing well by doing good as part of this. But that created a lot of confusion at the beginning, that we didn't recognize quite how much open would not mean, as Larry used to say, free as in speech, not free as in beer. So I think it's similarly free, open. I don't know what the analogy is here, but it's not free beer, I think is the point. So to that end, let me do a very quick sort of 30-second tour de table and ask you to close us out with kind of the one recommendation that you would have in terms of where we need to place our focus now in order to accelerate more data collaboration. So on the data stewardship, on the data governance, on these new business models, what's the one thing that you think we need to look forward to over the next year, and that when we get together a year from now, we'll look back on and should be asking you about in a year? So Ioana, let me start with you, and then I'll do a quick tour de table and we'll close us out.
Sure, thank you, Beth. Really, all the topics that were discussed are really super, really interesting, but not only interesting, but super challenging. And that's why I think it's very hard to pick one. But from my point of view, I think data literacy, and then in terms of data stewardship, but understanding data, because you understand value, understand usage, you understand the entire concept from the citizen until the very knowledgeable person in any public institution that shall deal with data. I think that's the most important from my perspective to focus on the next year. Thank you.
Laura, let me go over to you.
Well, I'm left with this thought about increased collaboration, but with a specific focus on comparative advantage. Because Peter and Jed, when you talk about, this independent information utility, the first place that I go is like, yeah, but how is like a nonprofit or even a government institution going to scale that across the entire internet? That is very, very costly from an infrastructure perspective. And so I think about how communities like this, people working across, whether or not it's public, private, third party, really taking a hard look at our comparative advantage and maybe, the scale of a company like Meta and the compute power, which we've always thought were really important tools in the toolbox when sharing data for public good. As Jed talks about, the companies that can process petabytes or terabytes of data, it's like not every local public health institution can do that. So I'm left with thinking about how we can get even smarter and this, touches the generative AI question on the comparative advantages that we all have in this space and how we can work together to sort of, again, maximize the public benefit while mitigating any risks or harms. And really just being deferential to each other, myself especially, to the best practices that people in the public and nonprofit sector can bring when we talk about how to maximize the good from these tools. I don't know if I should popcorn to someone or if Beth, you want to nominate another person.
Pop away.
Popcorn to Jed.
So that was to me? You broke up on my end. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would say data stewards, I think, are super important. I mean, I think that's the kind of the answer to my rally for talking about data products. We need professionals who know how to do this stuff. And so I do like the concept of data stewardship and data stewards as being like data product managers. And then, and Beth, you also said, you sort of teed me up. I'm like, it's data stewardship and business models that are most interesting to me. That's what we're working on. So that's what I'd like to say that we're going to look back on and say was a really good idea. So,
Peter, let's go over to you and we'll close out with Gretchen.
Yeah, first a response. I think you scale as a nonprofit by being very disciplined about what you don't do. And you don't do the things that others can benefit from. Aadhaar is a great example out of India. 300 million people registered with 35 people. And it scaled from there because of the discipline around what they did in collecting only 5 elements of information. But the thing I'm really focused on, Beth, for the next year is stranded assets. And I think we have a lot of stranded assets within corporations, data sets that are protected through IP and licensing that I would question, especially over time, how truly valuable those things are. And so are there accounting and licensing mechanisms that can release stranded assets to a trusted third party to gain more use? And that's really where I'm going to focus the next year.
Gretchen, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I just think in the next year, the opportunities with generative AI are significant. And it kind of going back to data literacy too, I do think it will open up opportunities for more people to interact with data, especially when we think about sort of the chat interface features, being able to query data, question data, and draw insights from it is very exciting. Also just using tools to visualize data. So it will be, I think, very exciting in the year ahead to see how we can explore that further and have more use cases around using generative AI to draw insights from data and enabling that for more people.
Well, we started on time and we're ending on time. But what I want to encourage people to do before I hand it back to Stefan to close us out is if there's any specific questions in the Q&A to which you'd still like to respond, I'd encourage you to put it in the chat so that everyone can see it along with the question. And please feel free to share any further responses. I want to thank you very much for being so generous with your time and your insights as usual. It's not enough time. We were just scratching the surface on so many important ideas, but we look forward to this being not the last, but the first of many conversations. And with that, let me thank everybody and pass it back to you, Stefan.